You didn't choose your first fear. Someone handed it to you before you could speak. Think about that for a moment. Before you had words, before you had memories you could consciously access, before you understood what a family even was, you were already absorbing something invisible, a frequency, a posture toward life, a way of bracing for impact that wasn't born from your own experience. It was inherited, like eye color, like the shape of a jaw. Except this inheritance lives not in your cells, but in the stories your family tells about itself, the ones spoken at dinner tables, and especially the ones never spoken at all. The ancient Greeks had a word for it, miasma, a spiritual contamination that moved through bloodlines, staining generation after generation, until someone, some singular figure of courage and clarity, finally broke the cycle. They wrote entire tragedies about it, the House of Atreus, the Curse of Oedipus. These weren't just dramatic entertainment, they were maps, psychological maps of something every human being has felt, but rarely named, the sense that you are living out a script you didn't write, in a play that started long before you arrived. Modern psychology arrived at the same territory through a different door. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the family psyche, the collective unconscious patterns that flow through kinship groups like underground rivers, invisible but powerful, shaping the emotional landscape of everyone drinking from that water. He observed that certain fears, certain compulsions, certain relational wounds appeared not just in individuals, but mirrored almost exactly across generations. A grandmother's unnamed grief appearing as a grandson's inexplicable anxiety, a great-grandfather's rage crystallizing into a grandchild's chronic shame. The symptoms change costume, but the wound beneath them is the same. What we're going to explore today is something that sits at the intersection of psychology, mythology, and spiritual wisdom. The understanding that every family is, at its core, a living myth, a story about who these people are, what they deserve, what they must fear, and what they can never have. And most of us are born inside that myth without ever realizing it is fiction. But here is where it gets genuinely extraordinary. Every mythological tradition in human history, from Greek tragedy to Buddhist cosmology to the Hermetic wisdom of ancient Egypt, recognize something that modern family therapy is only now beginning to articulate clearly. The myth can be rewritten, not easily, not painlessly, but it can be rewritten, and it only takes one person to begin. So the question we need to sit with, the one that will guide everything we explore today, is this. If the monsters you carry aren't truly yours, if they were handed to you by people who received them from people who received them before that, then who, in your family lineage, has the courage and the consciousness to be the last one in that chain? There is a particular kind of pain that is almost impossible to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. It isn't the pain of a specific wound you can point to and name. It isn't grief over a loss you can date on a calendar. It is something older and stranger than that. It is the pain of living inside a story that was never yours, of feeling emotions whose origins you cannot trace, of reacting to situations with an intensity that seems disproportionate, almost borrowed, as if the person responding isn't entirely you, but also every frightened ancestor who never got the chance to heal. Psychologists have a clinical term for this now. They call it intergenerational trauma transmission. But that phrase, precise as it is, strips away something essential. It makes the phenomenon sound like a passive accident, a simple inheritance, like receiving a piece of furniture from a deceased relative. What it actually resembles, when you look at it through the lens of mythology and depth psychology simultaneously, is something far more active and far more strange. It resembles possession, not in the dramatic, cinematic sense, not the shaking and the speaking in voices, but in the quieter, more insidious sense that Jung understood intimately, the sense in which an unintegrated psychic content, a complex, a wound, a pattern of relating, takes on a kind of autonomous life inside the family system and begins to live through whoever in the current generation is most permeable to it, most sensitive, most open, most undefended. The family's unresolved pain doesn't disappear when the person who originally suffered it dies. It migrates. It finds a new host, and it keeps moving until someone becomes conscious enough to stop it. Alfred Adler, Jung's brilliant contemporary and eventual intellectual rival, approached this territory from a different angle, but arrived at a remarkably similar conclusion. Adler observed that human beings are fundamentally social creatures, whose deepest drive is not, as Freud insisted, sexual energy, but the need for belonging and significance within a community. Within a family, This drive becomes almost overwhelming in its intensity. Children will do anything, absolutely anything, to maintain their place within the family system. And if the family system is organized around a particular wound, around scarcity or shame or rage or martyrdom, the child will unconsciously adopt that wound as the price of belonging. They will build an entire personality, what Adler called a lifestyle, around compensating for or perpetuating the family's central emotional myth. Not because they are weak, because they are brilliantly, desperately human. Here is the reframe that changes everything, and it is one that both psychology and spiritual wisdom have independently arrived at across centuries and cultures. What we commonly call a dysfunctional family pattern is not actually dysfunction in the sense of random, purposeless chaos. It is a myth that has calcified into compulsion. It began somewhere in the family's history as a response to a real threat, a real wound, a real catastrophe. Someone lost everything. Someone was humiliated beyond recovery. Someone lived through violence or starvation or exile, and that person's psyche organized itself around that wound in order to survive. And then they passed that organization forward, not as a burden, but as a gift, as the only map of reality they had available. This is how the world works. The pattern whispers across generations. This is what people do to you. This is what you must do to survive. The tragedy is not that the wound was passed forward. The tragedy is that the map was passed forward without the territory it was designed for. The descendants carry the survival strategies of catastrophes they never personally experienced, bracing for impacts that already happened to someone else generations ago. The medieval alchemists had a phrase for this kind of inherited, crystallized, unconscious pattern. They called it the prima materia, the raw, unrefined lead of the psyche, the base material that contains within it, paradoxically, the seed of gold. The same Hermetic tradition that gave us as above, so below, also understood that transformation is not the elimination of the dark material, but its conscious refinement. You do not escape the family lead, you transmute it. And the process of transmutation, every alchemical text insists, begins not with action, but with seeing, with finally, clearly, without flinching, seeing what the material actually is. Which brings us to the most quietly radical idea in all of family psychology, the one that Bert Hellinger spent decades developing in his work with family constellations, and that Joseph Campbell intuited decades earlier through his study of world mythology. The member of a family who begins to see the myth clearly, who starts to feel the shape of the invisible script and recognize it as a script, is not the weakest link in the chain. They are the most essential one. They are the point where the story can change. But seeing is only the beginning, because the myth doesn't release its grip simply because you've identified it. It fights back. And it fights back in ways that are specifically designed to feel like love, like loyalty, like the price of belonging to the people you need most. That is where the real work lives, in that exquisitely uncomfortable space between recognizing the pattern and choosing, consciously and repeatedly, to respond differently. And that is exactly where we are going next. Every family is a universe with its own laws of gravity. And just like the physical universe, those laws operate whether or not anyone living inside them understands or even acknowledges their existence. You don't have to believe in gravity to fall, and you don't have to be aware of your family's emotional mythology to be shaped by it, limited by it, or liberated from it. What changes when awareness arrives is not the existence of the forces. What changes is your relationship to them. And that relationship, cultivated with patience and intention, is where every genuine transformation begins. There are 5 movements in this process of transformation, 5 thresholds that the mythology of every culture and the clinical literature of depth psychology have independently mapped as the essential stages of what we might call the hero's work within the family system. They are not steps in a linear sequence. They are more like doors in a house you have always lived in, but never fully explored. You may find yourself walking through them in a different order. You may find yourself returning to the same door multiple times before it fully opens. But each one, when crossed with consciousness, changes the entire interior architecture of who you are and how your family's story continues. The first of these thresholds has a name that sounds simple, but contains multitudes. The ancients called it by various names across traditions. Anamnesis in Greek philosophy, meaning the recovery of forgotten knowledge. Smriti in Sanskrit, meaning remembrance of what was always true. In modern family therapy, It goes by a more clinical but equally profound label. It is called the act of naming the myth. Most families operate around an unspoken central narrative, a story so fundamental to the family's identity that it is never examined, never questioned, never even consciously articulated. It simply exists as atmosphere, as the emotional weather that everyone inside the system has adapted to so thoroughly that they experience it as reality itself, rather than as a story about reality. Some families organize around a myth of scarcity. There is never enough, there will never be enough, and wanting too much is dangerous. Some organize around a myth of persecution. The world is hostile, outsiders cannot be trusted, and to be vulnerable is to invite destruction. Some around a myth of unworthiness. People like us don't get to have beautiful things, loving relationships, peaceful lives. Some around a myth of martyrdom. Love means suffering, and suffering is how you prove your devotion. None of these myths were invented by the people currently living them. Every single one of them was forged in a specific historical furnace, a moment or an era of genuine catastrophe that made those beliefs not just understandable, but necessary for survival. The family of immigrants who fled violence and arrived with nothing developed a scarcity myth because scarcity was their daily reality. The family that survived persecution developed a distrust myth because distrust kept them alive. The problem, as the philosopher and mythologist Mircea Eliade observed in his studies of sacred and profane time, is that myths operate outside of linear time. They don't automatically expire when the conditions that created them change. They persist, they repeat. They become, in Eliade's language, an eternal return, a sacred pattern that the community keeps reenacting long after the original context has vanished. So the first practice is an act of archaeology. It requires sitting, perhaps with a journal, perhaps in contemplative silence, and asking with genuine curiosity rather than judgment, what is the central story my family tells about life? Not the story they tell at celebrations, the proud narrative of resilience and identity, but the story underneath that one, the emotional grammar, the unspoken rules. What is the thing that, if you violated it, would make you feel like a traitor to your bloodline? That feeling, that specific anxiety at the edge of your authentic self, is almost always pointing directly at the myth's core. You have found the prima materia. You are standing at the first threshold. Now here is where it gets genuinely destabilizing in the most necessary way. The second threshold is one that neither psychology nor spiritual tradition allows you to bypass, no matter how much you might prefer to. It is the threshold that Joseph Campbell, after analyzing the hero's journey across hundreds of cultures and thousands of years, identified as the unavoidable descent. He called it the road of trials, the belly of the whale, the meeting with the innermost cave. In family mythology terms, it has a more specific and more confronting name. It is the threshold of compassionate excavation of the wound's origin. This is the moment where you are asked to do something that feels almost counterintuitive given the pain involved. You are asked to look at the people who handed you the myth, the parents, the grandparents, the aunts and uncles and older siblings who transmitted these patterns into your nervous system, and to see them not as villains in your story, but as previous chapters of the same story you are now living. Alice Miller, the Swiss psychologist whose work on childhood trauma and its intergenerational transmission became foundational to the entire field, spent decades documenting what she called the drama of the gifted child, her term for the way that sensitive, perceptive children absorb their parents' unresolved wounds and spend their lives trying to resolve them on behalf of the family system. Her central insight was fierce in its clarity. You cannot heal what you cannot see clearly, and you cannot see it clearly as long as you are still protecting someone from the truth of their impact on you. But she also understood something equally important, something that the spiritual traditions have always known, and that pure clinical psychology sometimes misses. Seeing clearly is not the same as condemning. Understanding origin is not the same as excusing impact. The alchemical image is useful here again. The prima materia is neither good nor bad. It simply is what it is. Lead is not evil. It is the unrefined state of something that contains gold. Your parents' wounds are not evil. They are the unrefined state of a pain that predates them, that was handed to them by people who were themselves handed it, going back through the generations in an unbroken chain of unconscious transmission. The practice here is one of what the contemplative traditions call holy witnessing, the capacity to observe suffering, including your own, including that of people who have hurt you, with a quality of attention that is simultaneously clear and compassionate. In the Christian mystical tradition, this is related to what Meister Eckhart described as Gelassenheit, a profound, unsentimental release of the need to control or judge, a letting be that paradoxically creates the conditions for genuine transformation. In the Buddhist tradition, it is the practice of karuna, compassion, understood not as emotional warmth, but as the capacity to remain present with suffering without being destroyed by it or reacting to it blindly. You see the wound in your mother's eyes beneath her rage. You see the abandoned child in your father's silence. You do not excuse the behavior, but you stop being mystified by it, and in that moment, something essential shifts. This is the threshold where many people stop, because what it requires is a grief that most families have never given themselves permission to feel. It is the grief not just for your own losses within the family system, but for the losses of the people who hurt you, the losses they never mourned, the lives they never got to live, the healing that never reached them in time. This grief, when it is felt fully and consciously, is not weakness. It is, as the Hermetic tradition understood, through the symbol of the alchemical process of solutio, the necessary dissolution of the fixed structure before a new form can emerge. You have to let the old story become liquid before you can pour it into a new shape. The third threshold is where individual psychology begins to intersect with collective and spiritual practice in ways that are both ancient and urgently relevant. It is the threshold of ritual reconnection, and it addresses something that pure individual therapy, as powerful as it is, cannot fully reach alone. Because family mythology does not live only inside individual minds and nervous systems. It lives in the space between people. It lives in the relational field, the invisible web of attachment, expectation, loyalty, and fear that connects every member of a family system to every other member, across time and sometimes across death itself. Bert Hellinger's work with family constellations revealed something that initially seemed almost mystical to the clinical psychology community, but has since been corroborated by research into what scientists call field effects in family systems. The body holds the memory of the family, not just the individual. People who have never been told about a specific family trauma will, when placed in a constellation representing their family system, spontaneously adopt the posture, the emotional state, and even the physical symptoms of the family member who originally suffered that trauma. The field remembers what the conscious mind has been protected from knowing. What this means practically is that healing the family myth cannot happen entirely in isolation. It requires, at some level, a return to the relational field with a different quality of presence. And here is where the wisdom of every contemplative tradition becomes not just metaphorically relevant, but practically essential, because every major spiritual tradition has developed specific technologies for doing exactly this, for re-entering collective space in ways that interrupt compulsive patterns and introduce new frequencies into the shared field. The Rosary in the Catholic tradition is one of the most psychologically sophisticated of these technologies, though it is rarely described in those terms. When a family prays the Rosary together, something happens that transcends the content of the prayer itself. The rhythmic, repetitive nature of the practice activates what neuroscience now recognizes as the parasympathetic nervous system, moving everyone present out of the threat response mode, out of the reactive, defensive, guarded state that family gatherings so often trigger, and into a shared state of regulated, open, receptive presence. The body softens, the defenses lower, and in that softened, lowered defense state, the family members are briefly, genuinely available to each other in a way that the myth usually prevents. The prayer creates a temporary sanctuary from the myth's gravitational field. The same mechanism operates in any shared practice that combines rhythm, repetition, and collective focus. Shared meals prepared with care, family walks, communal sports, music made together, any ritual that requires coordinated attention and creates what the anthropologist Victor Turner called communitas, that extraordinary state of temporary equality and mutual vulnerability that dissolves hierarchy and defensiveness simultaneously. These are not merely pleasant social activities. They are, when understood through the lens of family systems psychology and spiritual wisdom simultaneously, acts of collective psychic hygiene. They cleanse the field. They remind the nervous system that these people are not only sources of old pain, but sources of real present connection. The fourth threshold is perhaps the most psychologically demanding, and the one that the spiritual traditions have described with the most precision and the most mercy. It is the threshold that the Hermetic tradition encoded in the principle "as within, so without," and that modern family systems therapy describes as the discipline of non-reactive presence. It is the art of being the still point in a moving system. Every family system has what therapists call homeostatic mechanisms, automatic processes that resist change and pull the system back toward its familiar patterns, however painful those patterns are. Familiarity feels like safety to the nervous system, even when it is destroying the person experiencing it. And so, when one member of a family begins to change, begins to respond differently, begins to refuse the role the myth has assigned them, the system almost always responds with pressure, sometimes subtle, sometimes overwhelming, to return to the original pattern. The person who was always the scapegoat suddenly finds new ways being invented to scapegoat them. The person who was always the peacemaker finds that every conversation becomes a minefield requiring their mediation. The person who carried the family's unexpressed grief finds that grief being projected onto them with renewed intensity. This is the moment that separates temporary insight from genuine transformation. Because insight is relatively easy, the human mind is remarkably capable of understanding its own patterns when given the right frameworks. What is extraordinarily difficult, what requires a quality of inner stability that every spiritual tradition has identified as the fruit of prolonged practice and genuine grace, is to maintain that understanding under pressure, to feel the full force of the old pattern attempting to pull you back, to feel the almost physical pain of disappointing people you love by refusing to play your assigned role, to feel the ancient terror of potential exclusion from the tribe, and to choose, consciously and deliberately, a different response. This is what the Stoic philosophers called the discipline of assent, the capacity to pause in the space between stimulus and response and choose which faculty of yourself you will respond from. It is what the Buddhist tradition calls mindfulness in relationship, the ability to remain aware of your own interior state while simultaneously remaining genuinely present to another person's reality. It is what the Christian mystical tradition describes as charity in its deepest sense, not mere kindness or politeness, but the active choice to respond to another human being from the part of yourself that recognizes their divine origin and their suffering simultaneously, rather than from the part of yourself that is simply reacting to the role they are playing in the family myth. The practical texture of this threshold is exquisitely subtle. It is not about becoming emotionally flat or strategically detached. It is not about performing serenity while internally seething. It is about developing what the psychologist and philosopher William James described as the capacity for radical empiricism in relationships, the ability to actually be present to what is happening rather than to what you expect to happen based on past experience. Your mother says something that has always triggered a particular defensive response in you. The old pattern is already mobilizing, already preparing the familiar reaction. The new capacity is the ability to notice that mobilization, to feel it without being controlled by it, and to ask quietly and genuinely, what is actually happening right now, beneath the surface of this exchange? What is the wound speaking? What would a response grounded in clarity and genuine care look like, rather than a response generated by the myth? This is slow work. It is humble work. And it requires what every resilience researcher from Emmy Werner to Anne Marston has identified as the single most consistent factor in genuine recovery from adverse childhood experiences: the capacity for meaning-making, the ability to locate your suffering within a larger narrative that gives it purpose, that transforms it from random cruelty into intelligible challenge, from senseless wound into meaningful threshold. The fifth and final threshold of this journey carries the most ancient name of all. In the language of alchemy, it is called the opus magnum, the great work, the culmination toward which all previous operations have been tending. In the language of depth psychology, it is called individuation. In the language of spiritual tradition across virtually every culture that has thought seriously about the human condition, it is called, in one form or another, becoming who you actually are, as distinct from who the family myth required you to be. And it is simultaneously the most personal and the most collective act available to a human being. Because here is the paradox that sits at the heart of everything we've explored today, the one that the Hermetic tradition encoded in its most fundamental principle, and that family systems research has independently validated through decades of clinical observation. When you heal yourself, you do not only heal yourself. The field changes. The myth loses one of its primary carriers. The pattern that has been moving through the family for generations suddenly encounters in you a place where it cannot continue unmodified. It hits the wall of your consciousness and has to do something different. This is what it means, in the most precise and non-sentimental sense, to break a family curse. Not through dramatic confrontation, not through severing relationships, not through announcing to everyone at Thanksgiving dinner that you have discovered the family trauma and are now going to heal everyone whether they like it or not, but through the quiet, consistent, daily practice of being someone who responds to life from a different place than the myth prescribes, through the accumulation of small, almost invisible choices to extend charity where the myth demands defensiveness, to offer presence where the myth demands withdrawal, to speak truth where the myth demands silence, to remain open where the myth demands the closing of every door. Marie-Louise von France, Jung's closest collaborator, and perhaps the most gifted interpreter of fairy tales as maps of the psychic journey, spent her career demonstrating that the figure in folklore who breaks the curse is never the strongest or the most powerful member of the community. It is always the youngest, the most humble, the one who was considered least, the one who stopped to speak kindly to the old woman at the crossroads when everyone else walked past, the one who chose mercy in a moment when cruelty would have been easier and more socially acceptable. In family terms, this figure is often the most sensitive member, the one who felt the myth's weight most acutely, who suffered it most visibly, who was perhaps most judged and least understood. And that person's apparent weakness, their sensitivity, their permeability to the family's pain, is revealed in the end to have been their greatest gift, because you cannot transform what you cannot feel, and the one who felt it most is, paradoxically, the one most equipped to transform it. There is a moment in every genuine healing process that no one warns you about adequately, because it cannot be fully described in advance. It can only be recognized when you are standing inside it. It is the moment when you realize that the family you are trying to heal was, in some essential and irreversible sense, also healing you. That the wound you were excavating was simultaneously the tool doing the excavating. That the myth you were trying to escape was, all along, the precise labyrinth designed to lead you to the exact center of yourself that you needed to find. This is the reversal that every genuine mystical tradition has placed at the heart of the spiritual journey, the moment the Sufi poets called fana, the dissolution of the self you thought you were, which creates the conditions for the emergence of the self you actually are. The moment the Gnostic texts described as gnosis, not information received from outside, but recognition arising from within, the sudden, unmediated knowing that what you were searching for was never absent. It was simply unrecognized. Jung spent the last decades of his life trying to articulate what he had observed in hundreds of patients who had genuinely completed what he called the individuation process. And what he found, again and again, was a pattern that had no adequate clinical language and required him to reach into the vocabulary of mysticism and alchemy to describe. The person who successfully integrates their shadow, who faces the inherited wounds without being destroyed by them, and without passing them forward unreflected, does not simply become a healthier version of their former self. They become, in some qualitative sense that transcends mere psychological adjustment, a genuinely new kind of person. Not new in the sense of having erased their history, but new in the sense of having transformed their relationship to that history so completely that the same events, the same family, the same wounds now tell an entirely different story. The Hermetic principle of correspondence, as above, so below, as within, so without, as the soul, so the universe, contains within it a temporal dimension that is rarely discussed, but is perhaps its most extraordinary implication. If the inner and outer worlds are genuinely correspondent, then a transformation in the inner world does not only affect the future, it retroactively changes the meaning of the past. When you heal the wound your grandmother carried and passed to your mother, and your mother passed to you, you are not only preventing its transmission to your children, you are in some philosophically precise and spiritually literal sense completing a healing that your grandmother was unable to complete in her lifetime. You are reaching backward through time with your consciousness and offering to those who came before you the resolution they never found. This is not metaphor, or rather, it is the kind of metaphor that points beyond itself to something more real than literal fact. Bert Hellinger observed it in constellation work with stunning regularity. When a living family member does the work of consciously acknowledging and honoring an ancestor's pain, when they say, in effect, "I see what you carried, I understand where it came from, I receive it with compassion, and I choose to carry it differently," something in the family field shifts, not only for that person, for the entire system, as if the field itself were waiting for that acknowledgement, holding the pattern in place precisely because it had never been witnessed with the quality of attention it required to release. The great spiritual traditions understood this as the work of prayer for the dead, the intercession, the dedication of merit, the practices that every major religion has developed for maintaining conscious relationship with those who have passed beyond the threshold of physical life. The Catholic Rosary prayed for souls in purgatory, the Buddhist practice of dedicating merit to ancestors. The Jewish Kaddish, which remarkably contains no mention of death, but is entirely an affirmation of divine greatness, spoken by the living on behalf of those who can no longer speak for themselves. These are not merely consoling rituals. They are, understood in their deepest function, technologies for completing the unfinished emotional and spiritual business of the dead through the conscious acts of the living. They are the family myth's most ancient and most sophisticated healing modality. And here is where the personal becomes cosmic in a way that dissolves the boundary between psychology and metaphysics entirely. If every human being is simultaneously an individual consciousness and a node in a vast network of familial and ancestral connection, if the wounds we carry are not only ours, but belong to a chain of souls reaching back through time, then the act of healing oneself is never merely a private matter. It is a contribution to the collective evolution of human consciousness itself. Sri Aurobindo, the Indian philosopher and mystic who spent his life mapping the evolution of consciousness as a cosmic process, described individual spiritual development not as withdrawal from the collective, but as the most direct possible service to it. The person who becomes more conscious does not become less connected to the human family. They become more genuinely useful to it because they bring into the collective field a quality of awareness and freedom that was not there before. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist and philosopher, saw the entire sweep of evolution as moving toward what he called the Omega Point, a culmination of consciousness in which individual awareness does not dissolve but is fulfilled in a communion so complete that the boundaries between self and other, between personal history and collective history, between present moment and eternal now, become transparent rather than opaque. In family terms, this vision suggests something almost unbearably beautiful, that the work of healing the family myth is not a burden imposed on the most sensitive member by historical accident. It is a vocation, a calling embedded in the very structure of that person's consciousness, which was made permeable to the family's pain precisely because it was equipped, at the deepest level, to transform it. So what does this actually mean for the way you live? Because philosophy without practice is, as every wisdom tradition has insisted with varying degrees of patience and severity, simply sophisticated avoidance. The most beautiful map in the world does not move your feet. And the understanding we have built together today, however genuinely illuminating, becomes nothing more than another interesting idea unless it finds its way into the texture of your daily choices, your habitual responses, your relationship to the specific, irreplaceable, maddening, beloved people who constitute your actual family. The first implication is simultaneously the most practical and the most demanding. It is this: the most powerful thing you can do for your family is not to fix them. It is to become in your own person the living demonstration that a different way of being is possible within this lineage. This is not a passive stance. It is not resignation or withdrawal or the spiritual bypassing that uses contemplative language to avoid genuine engagement. It is the most active possible form of presence because it requires you to bring your full, conscious, non-reactive self into contact with the full, unconscious, reactive reality of the family system day after day, without losing yourself in it and without abandoning it. The Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius, writing his private meditations in the middle of one of history's most demanding leadership roles, returned again and again to what he considered the single most important discipline available to a human being, the discipline of distinguishing between what is within your power and what is not. You cannot make your family members heal. You cannot force insight into consciousness that is not ready to receive it. You cannot, through the sheer force of your own spiritual development, drag another person's soul further along its path than it is prepared to go. What you can do, what is entirely within your power and entirely your responsibility, is to refuse to participate in the patterns that perpetuate the myth, not with aggression or moral superiority, but with the quiet, firm, compassionate clarity of someone who has seen the machinery clearly enough to step out of its gears. This means learning at a very practical level the difference between responding and reacting. Reaction is the myth speaking through you, the automatic, conditioned output of decades of absorbed family pattern. Response is the conscious act of a person who has seen the pattern, felt its pull, and chosen something different. The gap between stimulus and response, which the existential psychiatrist Viktor Frankl described as the space where human freedom lives, is a gap that has to be actively cultivated. It does not appear automatically. It is built slowly and imperfectly through the accumulation of moments when you catch yourself in mid-reaction and ask, is this mine? Is this true? Is this the response that the highest, most integrated version of myself would choose in this moment? The second implication concerns the shared practices we discussed in the third threshold, the rituals of collective reconnection that every tradition has preserved as technologies for softening the family field. These practices matter in a way that is easy to underestimate when you are in the middle of the psychological work of excavating and transforming the myth. They matter because healing does not happen only in insight. It happens in the body. It happens in shared time. It happens in the accumulated experience of being present with people in states that are not organized around the myth's central wound. Every hour spent in genuine shared activity with family members, whether it is a walk, a shared meal prepared together, a rosary prayed in common, a sports game played with laughter, rather than competitiveness, is an hour in which the nervous system is building new associative pathways between these people and the experience of safety, pleasure, ease. You are not only healing the myth intellectually, you are healing the body's memory of the family. And the body's memory is the deepest and most persistent archive of all. The third implication is perhaps the most counterintuitive, and it requires a particular kind of courage to hold. It is the recognition that your own healing, your own individuation, your own gradual emergence from the myth's gravitational field will almost certainly be experienced by some members of your family, not as a gift, but as a threat. Not because they are malicious, but because your change represents, to the unconscious parts of their psyche that are still organized around the myth, evidence that the myth might be optional, that the suffering might not have been inevitable, that there might have been all along another way, and that recognition, unmediated and sudden, can be genuinely destabilizing for people who have organized their entire identity around the myth's inevitability. This is where resilience becomes not a psychological buzzword, but a spiritual necessity. The word itself comes from the Latin resilire, to spring back, and the image embedded in it is precise, not rigidity, which breaks under pressure, but elasticity, which absorbs the force and returns to its essential shape. The resilient person is not the one who feels no impact from the family system's resistance to their change. They are the one who feels the full impact, allows it to move through them without being deformed by it, and returns to their chosen orientation without resentment or self-congratulation. They are the one who can be knocked sideways by an old dynamic at Christmas dinner and be back in their center by New Year's, not because they are invulnerable, but because they have developed, through practice and through grace, the capacity to find their way back to themselves. And this resilient returning, is itself a gift to the family, because every time you return to your center after being pulled out of it by the myth's gravity, you are demonstrating, in the most concrete possible way, that the center exists, that it is reachable, that a human being can live inside this family system and still be fundamentally free. We began today with the image of an inheritance, something passed forward through hands that could not quite hold it, through hearts that could not quite heal it, through generations of human beings doing their imperfect, earnest, wounded best with what they had received from those who came before them. The monsters, we said, were inherited. The fears were handed down. The myths were written before any of us arrived to question their authority. But we end somewhere different. We end with the recognition that inheritance is never only passive, that what you do with what you received is, in the most philosophically precise and spiritually serious sense, the question that your existence poses to the cosmos. not as a burden, as an invitation, as the specific, irreplaceable, unrepeatable contribution that only you, with your particular combination of wounds and gifts, your specific position in this specific lineage at this specific moment in history, can make to the ongoing story of human consciousness, finding its way toward its own deepest nature. The Emerald Tablet, that most ancient and most condensed of Hermetic texts, says something that has been translated and interpreted across 2,000 years of esoteric tradition, and that each generation seems to need to hear again in its own language. It says, in its essential core, what is below mirrors what is above, and what is above mirrors what is below, for the working of the one miracle, not many miracles. One. And that miracle, in the context of everything we have explored today, is the miracle of consciousness recognizing itself in the other, of the self-discovering, in the face of the person who hurt it most, the suffering that made that hurting possible, and choosing from the deepest available place to respond with something that has no adequate name in clinical language, but that every spiritual tradition has attempted to name anyway. Call it love, if that word has not been too damaged by its misuse. Call it charity in the ancient sense of caritas, the active, unsentimental, clear-eyed willingness to act for the genuine good of another, even at cost to yourself. Call it the decision, made daily and imperfectly, to be the place in your family's story where the myth finally, irrevocably, begins to change. The mystic said that the soul chooses its incarnation, that you did not arrive in your family by accident, but by something that resembles, if you squint at it from the right angle, a kind of vocation. The specific wounds you were born into, the specific myth you were handed, the specific people whose unresolved pain became the atmosphere of your formation, all of it was, in some framework larger than the one our ordinary minds can fully inhabit, the precise curriculum designed for the development of the precise capacities your soul came here to develop. You are not a victim of your family's story. You are not its hero either. If by hero we mean someone who arrives from outside the system with superior strength and superior answers, you are something stranger and more essential than either of those roles. You are the point in the lineage where the story became conscious of itself, where the myth looked in the mirror and recognized its own face, where the wound finally found a witness compassionate and courageous enough to see it clearly without flinching, without condemning, and without passing it forward unchanged. If these questions resonate with something you carry, consider staying with this channel, because this is what Mystery Hunter is, not a destination, not a place where final answers are dispensed to the spiritually deserving, but a continuing conversation between people who have decided that the examined life, however uncomfortable, is the one they want to live. The mysteries we explore here are not puzzles to be solved, they are depths to be inhabited. And the deepest mystery of all, the one that every tradition circles back to, from every possible direction, is the one you've been living with your entire life, in the specific house, with the specific people, carrying the specific inheritance that is yours alone. So here is the question we leave you with today, the one that doesn't get answered in a single sitting, or perhaps in a single lifetime. If the monsters you inherited were never truly monsters, but simply pain that had forgotten it, was once something else, something whole and original and unbroken, then what would it mean to love them back into their original form, not to defeat them, not to exile them, but to look at them with enough clarity and enough compassion that they remember, in the light of that attention, what they were before the wound made them monstrous? That question is your inheritance too. Perhaps the most important one. The hunt continues.